Welcome back to Retro Wednesday, the Tidarium Hangar. This is Mike. Today I want to talk to you about collecting modern figures and representations versus the actual vintage. According to my viewers, only about 30% of them actively collect vintage toy lines, and about 70% of them collect modern only. I'm going to talk to you about the reasons why they give me that the vast majority of them like to collect the modern representations versus the vintage figures. We're going to go over different multiple toy lines and discuss them and discuss these points coming up. We're going to start out talking about Transformers, and Transformers, of course, is where I get the vast majority of my feedback from my viewers. And with this, it had a fantastic TV show back in the 80s. You can't beat the show for Transformers, but one of the biggest problems with Transformers was that those figures did not match the cartoon. The aesthetic didn't match very well. Now, we kind of filled the gap as kids, and we made the difference with our imagination. But this day and age, we have much better representations. The other problem with the vintage toy lines, when it comes to Transformers, they did not scale well together. Some of the figures were way too big, some were way too small, and they weren't very cohesive as an actual toy line. Also, they did kind of look blocky and a bit odd. So with that, getting modern representations make a lot more sense to a lot of collectors. And nowadays, trying to track all these vintage figures down is very, very expensive for some figures. But I have to admit, more common stuff is still pretty cheap and pretty reasonable. If you want to get all of the mini accessories, though, that becomes a challenge. There's no doubt that this day and age, there's modern representations of Transformers from third-party companies or unlicensed companies. At last count, nearly 100 different companies making masterpiece Transformers over the last decade, and some companies don't exist anymore, but there's a lot of options for figures that look like they walked right off of the screen. I really can't say that for any other toy line. Definitely fixes all of those issues, including scale, aesthetic, matching the cartoon, and they don't look too wonky, and they're a lot easier to get for the most part, still kind of pricey. Hasbro with their Siege line, starting with Siege into Earthrise and Kingdom and forward into what they've got going on now, they have remedied all these problems. Now mainline Transformers, they scale well together. And the stuff that you get at Walmart is all going to scale well together. It looks pretty much like the cartoon, remedies all of those problems from back in the day, and quite a bit more affordable than trying to collect the vintage counterpart of Transformers. Getting into G.I. Joe, one of the largest toy lines ever, the cartoon was amazing. It was captivating and really did capture the minds of children everywhere, but also the original toy line was outstanding because the figures themselves had such awesome weapons and accessories. The figures themselves were affordable at the 3.75-inch scale. And of course, these did scale well together. And with that, collecting all of these wonderful, different, varied characters was a lot of fun and still is today. Vehicles are every bit as much of the toy line as the figures. You've got to have the figures doing something in those vehicles and play sets, and Hasbro did not let down with the G.I. Joe toy line. Going back and collecting those vintage figures and vehicles, the memories behind them when you got to play with those as a kid, and then you got to interact with them, and for the most part, the selling point that kids would say to their parents, these are real world vehicles and accessories and all of this stuff. It's like the real world. This isn't a fake and fantasy toy line in the beginning. There was nothing like walking in a toy store back in the day when G.I. Joe was out, or Transformers, or pretty much any of the other toy lines, and seeing shelves stocked full of these wonderful toys. Collecting G.I. Joe is still pretty easy. You can still find most items relatively affordable if you look hard enough, if you use a few tactics and techniques like buying lots of figures, weapons, and accessories, piece them together. Buying everything complete, of course, is going to cost more and more as you buy each figure complete. That's going to be challenging and expensive for the vintage line. The biggest problem for the vintage collector is the fact that there's almost 300 figures, if not more, counting all of the different variations, and the playset's about 100 vehicles in the line from 1982 to 1994. Around 2007, 2008, Hasbro kind of rebooted the line with the 25th anniversary, and these figures are outstanding. This is an amazing line of figures that I really love. Now, this is considered modern in a way. This is modern 4-inch. They're a little bit taller than original vintage ones, and collecting this can get you a better looking, better aesthetic of figure than we got with the original toys, but you don't have the same charm as a vintage. Some of the collector packs that were exclusives are still really hard to find, and of course those have grown in value over time. But one thing that's really I only see this in the G.I. Joe community, but they continue to number these figures. And when you look at the fact that the modern Tiger Force Duke is numbered Duke version 28, that's quite surprising. You don't see that with Transformers or Star Wars or any other toy line. Of course, if it was Star Wars, it would be version 1000. So I really think a lot of people look at modern G.I. Joe collecting as collecting the G.I. Joe Classified. Even though they're making O-ring figures and they're kind of going back to the roots and the original, really, if you're collecting modern collecting, it is the Classified. But there's a lot of problems with collecting Classified. G.I. Joe Classified is largely a figure-only toy line. Yes, getting vehicles like the His Tank for $300, and we don't know how much the Trouble Bubble is going to cost. It's going to be really hard to flesh out all 100 vehicles and 300 figures at this scale. But by the time you get to all 300 figures made, there will be over 1,000 figures because they're making multiple variations of every single character, and that becomes very hard to keep up with, especially since they're all numbered. But hey, it's a lot of fun collecting Classified. It's a roller coaster of a ride. Strap yourself in. If you're going to collect modern and Classified, it might even be easier to just go try to get a finite collection of vintage. Of course, Star Wars collecting is a little bit more finite than even G.I. Joe in a way, but based off of a movie instead of a cartoon, and the movie is epic. The original trilogy of 3 movies is epic, expanded into a whole lot more with the prequels, sequel trilogy, and all of the different TV shows and cartoons that have made along the way. But Star Wars is one of, if not the biggest franchise ever. Collecting these figures, it is finite. I like to say that because there's only 92 figures that were made. With all the variations, they talk about 96 up to 105 because there are a lot of minor variations that most collectors don't care about and won't go after. But this is something that you could set your sights on and complete. But in the modern era, you can't set your sights on and complete this for vintage collection, for retro collection, or for Black Series. So for that, I think it's a lot more fun to collect vintage Star Wars than anything in a modern iteration. There are a lot of vehicles, but way less Star Wars vehicles than G.I. Joe vehicles, and a lot easier to complete a full run of the figures and vehicles for Star Wars than G.I. Joe, and maybe even easier than with the Transformers and completing all of them. So with that, it's kind of fun going into the vintage era, but I really got excited about some of the modern things that they were making. Around 2012, Hasbro shot for the stars and they won. They had these larger vehicles. They reimagined the original Star Wars vehicles and got them closer to scale with what they call the BMF, or Big Millennium Falcon, for the Legacy time frame. And then we get into the AT-AT upscaled, and these were amazing. Now these feel like a modern representation of a vintage item, and it feels like something that if you collect vintage, you could collect this. And it was a continuation in a way for collectors, but it is still modern collecting. These are modern items. They are not vintage, but when you have something like this continuation, it's a lot of fun and it's very exciting. Fast forward to today, where we're working on cracking 300 vintage collection figures, and we're nowhere near completing the original 96 or even the 92. It starts to get a little bit challenging and frustrating for collectors of the original franchise. Now, if you want to get the flavor of the week, the new character they just came up with last Wednesday, and now it's going to come out with 8 different versions. Well, see, that's what modern collecting is all about, and isn't that fun? The packaging looks beautiful on the vintage collection figures. The figures themselves look amazing, and they're highly articulated, but prices are climbing and climbing. $14, $10 was a stretch on them originally when they hit the $10 price point, and they lost the outer collector shell. So that was a big frustration to collectors. For $10 for a bare bones figure with no protective case, now they're $14 and getting more expensive every day. And they're coming up with reasons to try to charge $18 a figure for these. So it's getting harder and harder to collect these than the vintage. But I have to admit that you still can't get vintage figures for under 20 bucks carded very often. Star Wars Black Series is plagued with the same exact issues as G.I. Joe Classified, as they're more or less a figure-only toy line. Getting vehicles for this are very few and far between, and less and less and less now than ever coming out for the Star Wars Black Series. But one more challenge for collecting these: if you like the retro property or the original trilogy, you seem to have to wait and wait and wait to get a new figure for the original trilogy. It's more of the modern media that they're pushing product for, and I guess I kind of understand that. So if you're in this to collect original trilogy, you've got to play an extremely long game. Thundercats is another one of those toy lines that had a pretty big toy line based on a very fun cartoon that still sort of holds up today in a way. There's way more to Thundercats than I even remembered, and a lot of these characters were brand new to me. But getting into collecting vintage Thundercats can be a challenge. You can find yourself getting outpriced very quickly, as some of the accessories are commanding $80 to $100 just for one accessory, and they're pretty big accessories too. Usually it's the tiny accessories that are easily lost, but these accessories, big accessories, and yet very expensive. So tracking down a complete set of the original Thundercats can set you back in the thousands, if not about 10 grand. There were way more playsets and vehicles made for this toy line than I even realized when I set out collecting Thundercats. I only remember a few of the figures, and the Thunder Tank didn't realize so much existed for this toy line. It is fun to collect, but again, challenging and frustrating. So in steps the modern era of collecting Thundercats through Super 7. Originally started with Mattel with the Matty Collector toy line, where they started with a few figures, 7 to be exact, based mostly off of their He-Man buck, and continuation of using that style and that platform for the Matty Collector till it dissolved, went away, and around 2017, Super 7 picked it up. The Super 7 designs are actually fantastic. They picked up where Matty Collector left off and started making their own iterations and their own figures, looking very good. But there are some quality concern issues with paint scratches, paint rubbing, and hardware not working quite properly, loose joints, and so on. But overall, it makes for an excellent display, and it can be a fun but expensive modern way to collect. Although I'm not a fan of repaints, they're giving a lot of options to get their figures again, and getting these through repaints and more classic designs so that you can continue to get the main characters as they go deeper into the line. And that's where a lot of these problems with these collector focused lines are. We don't get too deep because people can't get the original characters, and collectors don't want to continue to see the same figures over and over and over. So getting different iterations and repaints is good and bad. It's a double-edged sword. At this scale, vehicles are super duper expensive, and I know that people say that his tank's a great value at $300 and that the Thunder Tank for $500 is not. The problem with the Thunder Tank is the fact that Thundercats is a much smaller market than G.I. Joe, so there'll probably be at least 5, 6, 7 times more his tanks made than they make of this Thunder Tank, meaning the fact that this $500 price point is probably justified after all the tooling and all the stuff that goes into it. But it is going to be pretty amazing, and collecting vehicles at this scale, that's going to be a big financial challenge. Also getting into the Series 3 figures, the original vintage figures for Bengali, Linkso, and all of those figures, those can get very expensive trying to collect those. Now, one thing about Thundercats is the scale. They are pretty big figures, so this Ultimates toy line could sort of blend in and fill in the gaps. If you don't want to spend $200 or $300 getting a Bengali, get a $50 one from, or $55, from Super 7 and fill that gap, that might work out for you if you're a vintage collector. But I do see a lot of vintage collectors that collect modern. It's almost a 50-50 split, or maybe a 100 split. People that collect modern and vintage. When it comes to Thundercats, this is one of those toy lines that you see integration of modern and vintage. When it comes to Masters of the Universe, collecting vintage can be a challenge, but it's still relatively easy and affordable for the most part. For the vast majority of the characters, you can still find them online in good condition and track down the accessories and weapons. It is not really too hard. There are still a handful of figures commanding well over $100 in the vintage toy line, but the vast majority of the rest of them can be found for $10 or $15 if you look hard enough. They made a lot of vehicles, a wide range of vehicles, and the cool thing about all the vehicles and play sets and all of that they made back in the day, that they made these in the millions, so they are still quite abundant today. Now, tracking down all the parts and pieces with every toy line is a challenge, but Masters of the Universe seems to be one of those that is relatively easy, even in 2022, to track down actual vintage items. It's a little more challenging than it was a few years back, but still not impossible. The thing about collecting modern is that what's going on in modern is driving the vintage market in a way. The Origins figures are improvements to the original toy line, and these figures look exactly like the original figures with brighter colors and way more articulation, kind of what we should have gotten back in the day. Just really think about it. Origins is what we should have gotten as a kid back in the 80s with better articulations, because during the time they were battling some highly articulated opponents. But with this, it's a lot of fun to collect this, and you can integrate this with your figures. But if it comes down to it and they don't finish making all the characters in Origins, you could substitute in your vintage figures and they would look just fine. Arguably, Classics is the best representation that you can get this day and age, but I will have to say that the Masterverse is turning a corner, and some of those figures are rivaling even what Mattel did in Classics. Some of these figures look fantastic. They look amazing. Some are still just sort of okay at the end of the day, but I still think that it's a lot of fun collecting Masters of the Universe in 2022. As long as they can keep this going, we can continue to get figures, vehicles, and playsets, and it seems like the Origins vehicles still actually fit the larger Masterverse figures. Just when everyone thought the brand was going to die off, Eternia has saved Masters of the Universe. Seriously, this is probably the most exciting thing going on in the toy world, in the toy industry in 2022, and might still be the most interesting thing when it's released in 2023. Kenner Mask is getting rebooted by Ramen Toy this day and age. A lot of stuff coming for that. Kenner Centurions is being rebooted also by Ramen Toy in a smaller scale. There's not enough vintage demand from vintage collectors to carry on a vintage line. And Silverhawks has a relatively bright future between Super 7 and Ramen Toy, but looking forward to all of these releases in the future. But I'm curious what you guys think about collecting vintage versus modern. Are you one of the 70% that like to collect the modern only? Are you in that 30% that collect vintage? Or are my numbers completely wrong? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe. Titanium Hanger out.